evening, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining us on this very beautiful sunny day. My name is Lucy Bradnock. I'm Dean for Research here at the Courtauld and co-lead with Wenny at the back of the Courtauld's Art Ecologies Infrastructure Research Cluster. It's my huge pleasure to welcome you here tonight to mark the publication of Methods for Ecocritical Art History, edited by Olga and Andrew Patrizio. I feel like we should at this point be holding up the book.
There we go.
Here it is, actually in the flesh. And we also have some discount codes, I think, for those of you inspired after the event to purchase your very own copy. Ecocriticism is, perhaps unsurprisingly, in our present moment, one of the most important and exciting developments to activate the discipline of art history. This book provides a set of exemplars and tools that enable us to deploy ecocritical methods, showing both what these can bring to the practice of art history and how they might challenge its conventional epistemologies, and what the interdisciplinary and indeed intersectional project of ecocriticism can gain from art historians. Tonight, we will explore the book and the broader impetus of ecocriticism as a critical, methodological, and ethical framework for thinking about and with art and artists. We're joined by the book's editors, Olga and Andrew, and by Professor Klonk of Humboldt University in Berlin. And all three are really at the forefront of thinking and rethinking art history's purpose and parameters via this investment in the ecocritical. So I hope that our conversation will open up to broader conversations about the imperatives of our discipline at this present moment. Our evening will play out something like this. I'm going shortly to introduce our three speakers, then Olga and Andrew will share with us the rationale for the book and how it developed, and talk a little bit about what the book is and what it does, more importantly. Olga will offer a demonstration in action of the kind of methods outlined in the book, and then we'll convene at the front here to hear some reflections from Charlotta and to discuss, and also to take questions and ideas from the floor. We're going to aim to finish at around 7 o'clock or shortly thereafter, and we'll head down the corridor for more informal discussion and chat over refreshments in the research forum seminar room, and I do hope that you can join us for that. Our event this evening is hosted by the Courtauld's Art Ecologies Infrastructures Research Cluster, and it's supported by the really fantastic team in our research forum, including Diego Arteche, Leila Bonbra, and Grace Williams. And I'd also like to thank our student event assistant, Romy, this evening. She will be heading around with a microphone during the Q&A and generally looking after us and making sure everything runs smoothly. And now to our speakers. Andrew Patrizio is Professor of Scottish Visual Culture at the University of Edinburgh. His work in two main areas, Scottish art since 1945 and art, ecology and the environment, is informed by close engagement with art practice from collaboration, commissioning and writing. He's author, as you probably know, of the fantastically useful book, The Ecological Eye, Assembling an Ecocritical Art History, also published by Manchester University Press in 2018. Olga Smith is an art historian and curator based at Newcastle University. Her research across different topics concerns the search for narratives of identity and belonging that are attuned to the realities of the globally connected world we inhabit today. Her research spans topics such as ecocriticism and landscape, interchanges between art and intellectual ideas, transnational identity, and histories of photography, and has been supported by a Mary Skłodowska-Curie Actions, Horizon 2020, and the AHRC. She's author of Contemporary Photography in France from 2022 and editor of the volume Photography and Landscape. Her most recent project considers the overlapping issues of ecology, labour, and motherhood in art and life. Charlotta Klonk is Professor of Art History at the Humboldt University in Berlin, where I think she's also head of department, so much to be taking on there, and a member of the German National Academy of Sciences, Leopoldina. She's held fellowships at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, the Institute of Advanced Studies in Berlin, and the Clark Art Institute in Williamstown. Her research And multiple publications have focused on histories of science and the perception of landscape, critical methods and historiography, making her absolutely the perfect interlocutor this evening. Welcome, Charlotte. I'm going to hand over to Olga and Andrew to begin to unpack the book, and I hope that you'll join us afterwards with questions. Hold those right to the end and do join us in conversation. Welcome, Olga and Andrew.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much, Lucy, for the invitation, the chance to be here. Thank you to Diego, Grace, Romy, everyone involved in the Research Forum. And obviously for Charlotte to coming over to have a conversation with us. We will keep the first half of this introduction relatively informal, to give a sense of the flavour of the book. And then, as Lucy said, Olga will speak to her writing, and then we'll have a chance to have a wider conversation. It is also a chance to thank people directly involved in the project. Obviously, we have 23 authors who have all been incredibly engaged and helpful and insightful over many, many years. This project evolved, and I'll come on to this in a minute. But also, I'd like to say a thank you to Olga. Olga and I met probably 5 or 6 years ago and had enough in common, I think, to make a project like this very, very productive, because we share a lot of ideas, I think, in a lot of directions. But we also have very productive, I think, relatively minor differences of take. I think that also helps. I think the difference that makes a difference is also very important. So it was a real honour and a joy to work with Olga. So let me get to the next.
I'll just quickly say thank you as well to Andrew. We joke about this. I call it unfounded optimism that Andrew brings to the project, which is matched by my well-founded pessimism, which is realism. So, but it has been a pleasure to work with Andrew, and I do think that the point that we do share in common is this passion for art and passion for social justice through the prism of ecology, and so it's been a wonderful journey. And just very quickly also say my personal thank you to Charlotte Klonk, who came here all the way from Berlin. She genuinely is one of the scholars that I respect the most, and she's been, for me personally, important in my development as an art historian. So it's really special for me to have her here. So that's it. Just my thanks from my side, and I hand over to Andrew.
Yeah, just to say, this is part of a little series, a little tour of chances to present the book. So, as we say here, Olga is soon on her way to Ingolstadt to also talk about the book with colleagues who know of this kind of work and are engaged with this kind of work very deeply. I'm also on my way this week to University of California, Davis, where there is a colloquium on art history and climate change. I'll be speaking with Bradnock there as a two-header. So, and then we're gathering at the Association for Art History in Cambridge in April, a chance to meet some of the authors there and talk about the book a little bit more. Right, we're going to think a little bit more about now.
Oh, promotion though. Sorry, I'm going to do promotion.
Oh, yes, okay.
So Andrew leaves this to me, but I am happy to do that. So if you would like a 30% discount, here's a discount code. So I'm just going to leave it here, and then we're going to go back to the intellectual reviews.
Never miss a chance.
Oh, my turn, in fact. So this is kind of just to present some of the notions in the book, and beginning with the idea of ecocritical art history. What is ecocritical art history? This is our preferred term, but there are other relevant variants, such as environmental art history, eco-aesthetics, and eco-art history. And so we are quite agnostic about those terms. We don't really insist on preference for any of these. We just happen to use ecocritical art history, but there are many others. I think it's also fair to say that in the course of the last decade, ecocritical art history has not only gained in prominence, but also expanded prodigiously, not most notably in terms of its range of subjects, topics, and motifs. Whereas I think it's fair to say that in the early stages, ecocritical research has been primarily concerned with artifacts, objects, and images that relate to the world of nature, with a prominent emphasis on the genre of landscape. And another kind of important and well-researched aspect of environmental art history would be land art or earth art, and different forms of environmental activism represented. And so these are kind of like formally the key areas of ecocritical research. But I think today there's a sense that there's a growing consensus that the practice of ecocriticism need not be restricted to a particular subject, period, medium, intention, or indeed politics. In a major reassessment of art historical ecocriticism, Alan C. Bradnock offered a designation of ecocritical interpretation as, and I quote, a mode of inquiry that engages ecology as a constitutive element of artistic practice, regardless of place, period, medium, maker, or message. And there is a generous and generative inclusivity in this definition that we welcome to claim eco-intimacy mortem that all art is ecological. All art is ecological in its potential to reveal vital interdependencies between the human and the rest of nature, with ecocriticism encompassing methodologies, techniques, and forms of awareness that can be mobilized to identify, interpret, and understand these critical interconnections.
Yeah, so I love the paradox, or there's a paradox I certainly want to underline here at the heart of ecocritical art history. On one level, it demands a kind of expansive and horizontal kind of art history, a kind of a radical contextualization of the objects that we look at and the conditions of their production. But it also encourages a very close-looking and mindful attention to artworks. And those are skills that I think art historians have, and we place them at the center, reclaiming the visual ecologically. And this is something that obviously the ecological eye, which is now 8 years old, was kind of my manifesto or my approach of a sense of urgency and a sense of the discipline needing to catch up. And obviously there were exemplars and pioneers before I wrote that book. But to me, it feels like a much busier environment now than it did 8 years ago. And I think that book was devoid of writing about any art practices. And this book is full of global case studies, global exemplars. Now, being involved and being at the heartbeat of ecocritical art history as an individual, those people, I think, feel the benefit of having conversations beyond art. And I think that one of the reasons for that is that because it has its origins outside our discipline. And in that, it actually shares characteristics of other standard methods and approaches in art history: psychoanalysis, feminism, queer theory, post-colonialism. And we welcome that kind of outwardness, the fact that we're driven by externalities as well as internal forces too. We can have productive conversations with people working in environmental science. We can have productive conversations also with people in political ecology. We can underline ideas of justice, ethics, and activism, which I think are becoming increasingly urgent and pressing within our discipline. And that diversity obviously stretches across other humanities, but also, I say, in a wider sense of both the social sciences and the harder sciences. And the list can go on and on and on. And I personally welcome and I get energy from that diversity. In a way, I see it as connected to 1970s, new art history, the move towards thinking about art history that went beyond conservative and market-led and connoisseurial forces. but in a much more expanded and I think a much more kind of adventurous and radical extension of that 1970s impetus. And also, and I won't belabor this point because I belabored it in the Ecological Eye, but I think it's also worthwhile saying that to be part of eco-critical art history is also to push against some of the stereotypes that are still very, very persistent within our discipline, that still continue a kind of narcissistic sense of privilege in the discipline, with individuals patrolling their own small areas, rather depoliticized obsessions, and believing and acting as if they have some kind of divine entitlement to take a salary to explore their own small historical conundrums. I'll leave that just hanging there. But I do think that way that the history of art history, part of that history, has been kind of complicit in framing and abstracting nature and its materials in problematic ways. And I think being part of a kind of a movement that looks to put a critical gaze on that extractivist and violent regime that has been dominant over a few centuries, at least since the rise of art history itself, is important. And Danin Lee, one of the contributors to our book, put it very well. Art historians perforce must consider both the narrow provincialism of their particular subfields, as well as the inextricable embeddedness of all subfields within a web of relationships subject to environmental conditions. In short, planetary ecologies of art have always existed, but we are only just now recognizing them. So I do feel that this sense of interdependence is one of the reasons why eco-critical art history is one of the most lively and compelling areas for art history at the moment. And methodologies, techniques, forms of awareness allow us to identify and interpret and understand these crucial interconnections. I mean, broadly, this could be positioned as a post-human, I think, orientation, particularly in post-humanism's sense of challenging ingrained anthropocentrism and human exceptionalism, which of course is one of the ironies that art history so often validates human exceptionalism. But I think we're looking at something that could be rather more broad than that. So taking account of factors like animal life, plants, geology within the framework of eco-critical analysis, which involves, again, externalizing our competences, externalizing our expertise in connection with others. And again, it's worthwhile being inspired by other writings, particularly Linda Smith, who put this, I think, very well, to confront the Western academic canon in its entirety, in its philosophy, pedagogy, ethics, organizational practices, paradigms, methodologies, and discourses, and importantly, its self-generating arrogance. So drawing inspiration and drawing life from critical views that have come from very diverse fields has been really important to us.
And this quote is the first line in the book. This book makes a case for art history to adopt, as a matter of urgency, the method of eco-critical analysis. In the face of ecological crisis, there is an ethical and political imperative to act with what tools we have. Alongside this demand, we call for the contribution of eco-critical art history to be acknowledged within the eco-critical project and the adjoining fields of research under the umbrella terms of environmental humanities and environmental sciences. And this double imperative gives our project a sense of distinctive agency, both within art history and in the wider world. And so I guess I'll just dwell a little longer on this idea that we call for the contribution of eco-critical art history to be acknowledged within the eco-critical project, because there's a sense, in any case, this is definitely my sense, that the voices of art historians have not, or have been largely missing from the conversations within the field of environmental humanities and its institutional frameworks, including publications, memberships of research centers, dedicated bibliographies. And perhaps this is due to the lack of clear understanding what art history has to offer as allies, or perhaps we have neglected to insist upon this necessary alliance. It's a question mark over that, but nevertheless, it has been, in my experience, the case. So one important consequence is that all too often artworks in this context are reduced to an illustration of an idea, an epiphenomenon, a means of raising awareness in the service of environmental science, or at the opposite end of the spectrum, are treated as manifestations of the ineffable, a mute symbol, a pure emotion. So, the images of the bears are polar bears on the icebergs that are circulating in the media. That's just pointing at the pictures and saying, there it is. But of course, there is an art to art history, and I'm evoking here Patrizio's title, that requires readiness to confront artworks as vital force, a paradox, a challenge, and a revelation. And we believe that that interdisciplinary project of ecocriticism has much to gain from working with art history, its framework, skills, and methods. The skills of art historians are especially relevant, given that our current predicament relates in crucial ways to the problems of visuality, even as it takes the form of counter-visuality, as a means of, and I quote, contesting Anthropocene visually. We argue for the quintessential tools of art history, close looking, contextualization, paying attention, to be placed at the task of reclaiming the visual ecologically. Methods already standard in art history will thus be of use to us, to our ecocritical inquiry, as it urgently reconfigures them in the conditions of unnatural crisis. One brief example would be noting Aulus Regal's concern with interconnectedness, variety, and symmetry in artistic development in problems of style, or his discussion of attentiveness in Dutch painting. So one crucial point emerging from this book, then, is the potential for all standard art historical methods to be revisited with ecological and environmental concerns most. Our current predicament is also fundamentally a historical problem, and as such it requires historical perspective. Art history, of course, has developed a wealth of expertise that is on display in this volume. Certainly contemporary art has been the prime focus of ecocritical art history because it is contemporary with the emergence of crucial terms such as the Anthropocene. But it is also clear that more recent interventions point to a rich tradition of ecological visuality and art predating the contemporary period. As many contributors to this volume demonstrate, critical art history resists straightforward chronology and offers instead new ways of working across temporalities by engaging with the ideas of anachronism, more than human temporalities, and planetary geohistory.
Just to give then, to move towards what's actually in the book and how it's structured. So here are some of the impulses I think that drove us in our early conversations about what we were going to do and what we felt needed to be done. One thing I felt very strongly was a need for orientation within this disciplinary territory, which obviously is very mobile, in a state of flux, and as I mentioned at the beginning, growing very, very rapidly, and with multiple complex and not always uniform positions within that. I've been teaching courses around this subject for certainly more than 10 years, maybe nearer 15, and the need for orientation for students I felt was really, really important in what is a kind of a eco-critical overwhelm, not just within the discipline, but of course within the state of the environment and the globe generally. So we themed it eventually around these 6 sections, which we'll speak very briefly about in a minute. But also it's important to say that there's an introduction, a general introduction, written in as jargon-free sort of terminology as we could muster. I'm not sure it's completely free of all jargon, but it's pretty jargon-free. And also it's small, shorter introductions to each of these themes, very much pitched towards people coming to ecocritical art history relatively new, in a way to kind of help that orientation process. But then, I think in quite an unusual move, it has 23 chapters that are deeply specialist and deeply involved in their own areas, and that is an incredibly broad set of areas. And the other thing I would highlight is again, I think we've touched on it already, but this frustration with orthodox art history's resistance to embracing climate emergency, and in a way that other humanities areas certainly have done. So it is a first book to deal explicitly with methods around eco-critical art history. I'm sure it won't be the last, but it does, I think, both complement and move in a particular kind of way in a more interpretive and active mode towards eco-critical thinking and what one would actually do if one wanted to write in an active eco-critical kind of way. It is global in range, but not comprehensive, but it's certainly global. It addresses colonial race and indigeneity in a more expansive way than I've been able to do before. And I would also say that we involved like different voices who were coming from not only different perspectives, specialist perspectives, but also had different positions within academia, which we felt was also very important. We tried to express a sense of urgency around this, that this idea of eco-critical art history, it doesn't exist in a bubble, and urgencies, real life urgencies, press down on our methods as well as people working beyond the academy. We also want to just address the way that we put this together. More generally, I would say this is a fantastic model. It's a kind of model I've used to a certain extent before, which is the relatively small workshop space that is very open. We had 2 online sessions with individuals giving papers, many of which then turned into chapters within the book. That was in 2021, and then in 2022 we met in Vienna. It was not hybrid. We had to be there in Vienna. It was great that Lucy was actually able to join us at that particular point, for that lovely 34 degrees of academic sweat that we expended. But there, the real ideas of how the book might be put together was proposed and thought through. So we certainly have a number of chapters beyond Europe and North American focus. There's content from Indonesia, Hawaii, South Africa, Nigeria, India, China. And it puts case studies, as I say, right at the center. So a way of showing a method in action and offering new research rather than the general overview, which we deal with elsewhere. And it's trying to show exemplars of models of action, which I think are very, very important. Yes, there's a very happy, Lucy, you're there. But participants aged from about 1-year-old, I think, to some of us at the more senior end. But there's some very, very brilliant minds in that group.
Thank you. Yes, so to add a little bit more to the book structure that Andrew has begun to outline. So when organizing this very diverse material that we had at our disposal, we were very much, well, I certainly was very much mindful of the pedagogical value of this book. And this is, I was just saying to some of you that I'm really curious now what the book is going to do now in the real world in terms of our pedagogical intent with it, whether it's going to be used in the classroom and how it will be used. But certainly in terms of organizing the material into these 6, we hope, very straightforward categories: space, time, bodies, matter, and beings. We're very much driven by the idea that this will be useful for students. And so with this in mind, the essay, the editorial essay that the book opens with, I would even say that we're aiming not just for clarity, but also for a manifesto style of writing, because we're both, as everyone else in this room, I'm sure, is really fed up with the lack of action. And so we kind of wanted to find the language that would express that frustration. And this is very much driven for me as well with my experiences with students who, as I'm sure, again, like most of you would have encountered this, are driven by this passion, and also then are then met with the brakes on how much personal action can achieve in the real world. And so the book is very much addressed to them and to colleagues who are interested in teaching with these methods. And just to kind of like highlight it, the pedagogy has been very much part of this project and very much feeding into this idea of introductions for each of these sections, which are, by the way, available in free access online, so you don't have to pay for that at all. It's on Manchester University website. If you go into the website for the book on Manchester University Press website, you will find in the description it points you to a site where you can just download them and use them for free. And so we really want them to be used in a classroom situation, and they're accompanied by what we call syllabi, a selective list of bibliography attached to each topic, again in free access. And the idea is that it's very much providing of tools, but the students will use these tools to walk the path of their own choosing through these essays. So starting with space, then this is the first section, and what we wanted to say here is that ecocritical approaches challenge art history's disciplinary attachment to the category of place by bringing into play environmental materiality of places, to consider them as part of planetary and global commons. To explore these debates, this section is structured around the tropes of the place and the planet and the different commitments they entail. If place is defined as specific and local, then planetary urges us to consider spaces as part of a globally interconnected ecosystem. The second section, time, periods and timescales, deals with another very prominent and very traditional category in art history, which is the time, that of time and periodization. We examine here the implications of timescales that belong to the ecological cycles of the planet and the effect of such radical transposition on art historical periodization and methods, and the notion of historical development and the very concept of time as linear and progressive. This poses a challenge to traditional methods of art history, processes or in geological time that occur at vastly slower rates of hundreds and thousands of millions of years, seem incommensurable with the pace of change in the development of a painterly style or a shift in the cultural paradigm. So this collision of scales we highlight entails a radical heterogeneity in the forms of historical description that our authors explore in this section.
Again, just to give you a very quick flavour of bodies, which again will probably not be unfamiliar to you, trying to draw on feminist justice movements, which of course have been one of the most productive over the last 40, 50 years in our area. Ecofeminism in particular, embracing a critique of sexism and associated racism, classism, heterosexism, ageism, ableism, and ethnocentrism. And then the strands of ecofeminists from the more philosophical areas to the more politically engaged areas, continental traditions, and also involving queer theory and queer ecology, which is an incredibly vibrant area. Both elements, the feminist and queer theories, I think bring attention to the politics of intimacy, an idea fundamental to environmental humanities work. The emphasis here is given to affects, bodies and emotions, internal climates, one might say, and the tension experienced personally around the core concepts in histories of feminism and queer theory, namely patriarchy, hegemony, and difference.
This section is structured around the central concept of matter as material substance that constitutes the words material phenomena. The term material ecocriticism emerged in environmental humanities to study matter, and this is a quote from Cyril Opperman, the way material forms, bodies, things, elements, toxic substances, chemicals, organic and inorganic matter, landscapes, and biological entities interact with each other and with the human dimension, producing configurations of meanings and discourse. End of quote. This term is new to our historical discourses, and yet it seems uniquely pertinent to the task of bringing together a range of approaches that engage with the matter of art to ultimately confront many of art history's certainties, including its ingrained anthropocentrism and the view of materials as raw, inert, and infinitely available, which is of course essential to the idea of extractivism.
Again, just the last two, and I'll try to be brief. Beings, sort of multi-species methods, is clearly a push against anthropocentrism and privileging the human, and recognizing the multi-species methods and its attention to networks of relations reposition art history beyond the human alone. And there's a kind of direct level where we acknowledge the widespread adoption of figures of animality in human practices, language, culture, and symbolic realms. We're very familiar with that already in art history, but more challenging when we start to think about art history recognizing agency, autonomy, influence, and the status of beings beyond human alone, and what kind of violences are associated with suppressing that agency of others beyond the human. And that has related to an extraordinarily active area that sits adjacent to art history, which would be something around critical plant studies and cultural awareness of mycelium and fungal structures, for example, the flora and fauna more generally, and how nature and its support forms communicate, decompose, and distribute agency in new and challenging kinds of ways. And the implications here is that art history could embrace a kind of critique of speciesism as a primary form of domination. And then in part 6, I'm looking at something we're calling communities, particularly focusing on decolonial indigenous frameworks, connects eco-critical methods to the problems around the European colonial project as a whole, and bringing attention to post and decolonial scholarship and long-standing indigenous philosophies that create space for new approaches to art history, and feeds back, I think, to the space section that Olga's already talked about, the need for a global perspective and an expansive global perspective at that. And we say at the end of this section, ultimately the lesson must be that attentiveness to all kinds of inter-community violence and a sensitivity towards one's own relation to these unequal conditions across cultures is incumbent in any eco-critical art historical inquiry. Okay, now that's the book, and now we're going to look at method in action.
So what we thought that we wanted to do today, since I'm not only the editor but also contributor to the book, and since I'm here, we thought we might as well have this opportunity to actually show what we call a demonstration of method in action. So this is one of our case studies that, again, I hope will be useful in terms of teaching. And so this is a presentation of a part of a chapter that I contributed that's entitled Ecopolitical Aesthetics of Weeds, and it's in the multi-species part of the book. A plant sprouting from a gap in the pavement attracted the attention of Jean-Luc Moulin as he walked along the Rue de Bercy in central Paris. In the course of the next 7 years, the French artist would observe and photograph the plant on his daily walks to ultimately produce a series of 299 photographs entitled La Vigie. The plant at the heart of this documentation is actually a tree known in the European context as Paulownia tomentosa, commonly known as foxglove or emperor's tree. Originating from North China and Korea, it was exported into Europe in the 19th century through the trade routes established by the Dutch East India Company. Valued for its decorative blooms and fast-growing habit, the tree was planted around many public spaces in Paris. The subject of the artist's study, however, was not a cultivated specimen, but an escapee from mother plant. This plant is inescapably and perilously embedded in its own context. The photograph showed growing from a crack between the tarmac and cobblestones, continually under threat of being trampled on and eradicated. In this context, rather than its biological or aesthetic features, what condemns the plant to the status of a weed is its context. Humble weeds have been gradually emerging from the margins of discourse in nature writing, garden design, and urban studies. Ruderal species came into view at the same time as the plant turn was sweeping through the humanities and sciences, alongside rediscoveries of indigenous of indigenous teaching of plants. This research has been driven by an ethical imperative to understand plants as agential and intelligent beings deserving of respect. And this has been important in confronting anthropocentric conceptions of all matter, including vegetal, as passive and inert, used as a justification for its growing exploitation. In ways that overlap with research in multi-species ecology, critical engagement with plants produced a much more calibrated field of agency and models of behavior within more than human relations than has previously existed. These achievements are significant, but there is now a growing sense that it is not enough to recognize that plants are alive with intent and intelligence. I intervene into these debates to foreground the issue of political representation in relation to vegetal matter. I do not deal with the issue of plant agency, nor do I speculate concerning the forms of adequate representation of the modern human in the polity. Rather, in my essay, I bring the insights from political theory of Jacques Rancière to the study of Moulin's engagement with the weed in La Vigie, to pay close attention to the aesthetic and medium-specific effects of the artwork, as well as the spatial presentation in an installation. And of course, this ended up being the cover for the book, this particular image, so I think it's also really lovely to have it in the talk here to explain the context where it came from. This work was exhibited at the Galerie Chandal-Cauzel in Paris in 2019 as a continuous two-tier frieze that wrapped around the architecture of the gallery. The top tier contained close-up photographs of the plant taken across the annual cycle of seasons. The artist tempers the instantaneity of the photograph with an understanding that plants operate in a time scale much slower compared to human, and therefore require long-term commitment and extended attention. Such forms of attentiveness resulted in a series of precise close-ups that could be described as photographic portraits of a plant. The lower tier of the frieze contained different kinds of photographs. These showed the views of the urban surroundings of the plant in the busy Bercy neighborhood, dominated by major infrastructure links and civic buildings, including the Gare de Lyon train station. At the circumference of the urban context represented in the bottom section of the photographic frieze stands Polonia tomentosa, a green sentinel keeping watch over its surroundings. Indeed, La Vigie is translated from French as the lookout post, or someone standing on lookout. The title also refers, through its association with the term vigilance or surveillance in French, to Plan Vigipirate, the French national security alert system. Its ostensible purpose is to determine the terrorism threat level and respond accordingly by increasing security measures, especially around strategic and vulnerable locations. The Ministry of Economics and Finance, whose imposing architecture dominates many of the views in La Vigie, was one such site. Between 2004 and 2011, the period of Moulin's observational study, the alert had been raised to the highest level several times, notably in response to the bombings in Madrid, in London, and assassination of Osama bin Laden. A state of emergency declared in France in 2005 was the cause of another major security alert. The declaration was made in response to a wave of civil unrest sparked by an incident that left 2 youths from minoritized ethnicities dead as they fled from the police. Civil violence spread rapidly through immigrant-dominated suburbs of Paris, laying bare the divisions articulated along spatial, social, and ethnic lines that have roots in France's history of colonization. Politicians like Nicolas Sarkozy, then the Minister of the Interior, exploited these divisions to stoke up nationalism and xenophobia. Sarkozy, at the time, presided over the introduction of a series of anti-terrorism legislations that gave the state extraordinary powers to police its citizens through increased electronic surveillance and enhanced security measures enforced through the Vigipirate system. The photographs in the lower tier of La Vigie bear witness to these events. In contrast with the images in the top tier, Here, Moulin uses the camera to produce a record of the events in the expanded tradition of social documentary. The images reference the events sometimes obliquely through vague traces left on the pavement, but Moulin can also be more direct. He photographs protesters with placards in front of the ministry, or construction equipment that has been used to embed counter-terrorism security measures into urban design. One of the main visual manifestations of the increased security measures was the appearance of metal barriers set up to safeguard strategic locations. The photographs show steel barriers wrapping around the buildings like chains, obstructing passageways and roads. These security measures, though, had one unintended consequence. Metal barriers provided shelter for the plant, allowing it to grow uninhibited on a street cleared of pedestrians. This meant that the period of its most vigorous growth coincided with periods of greatest concern in national global security. With the removal of the barriers, as the alert level dropped down to non-emergency level, the plant was exposed once again to the ebb and flow of urban life. The juxtaposition of the images in the two levels of La Vigie then sets in motion a countervailing dynamic that imposes the matters of ecology onto geopolitics and with equal force causes issues of national security to intrude on nature and its eternal cycle of seasons. Social, economic, and political forces act upon ecological environmental factors and at the same time being acted upon. Moulin's project, bounded by photography's propensity towards the particular, was steeped in a context specific to France. But these insights scale up to the planetary level. It is now widely accepted that climate change interacts with many vectors, including economic and political, that cause mass displacement of people and lead to instability and conflict. The threat of terrorism that features so prominently in La Vigie is another associated implication of climate change, known in the realm of policy as threat multiplier. An ecocritical analysis then reveals that a weed growing in the wrong place encroaches on matters of politics, social integration, and national security. In this reflection, I found political thought of Jacques Rancière and his articulation of disagreement immensely productive. The values of disagreement, or dissensus, are at the core of Rancière's intellectual project and are linked to his influential understanding of politics as a radical force of disruption of what he called the police order. I won't go into police order or dissent in this particular case. It's all in the essay if you'd like to know more. But I just wanted to, in this context, to highlight the value of disagreement and what I think is a necessary and productive discussion of political agency of plants. By emphasizing the antagonistic value of disagreements, I go against the tendency in plant studies to advocate for consensus and peaceful coexistence, whether as a form of companionship or collaborative survival, or through affective encounters. In contrast, in this essay, I want to engage with the stages of the weed as a plant out of place, an irritant, an intruder, and a threat. Plants become weeds when they obstruct our plans, our tidy maps of the world, rights which it may be. In pursuing this line of inquiry, I reach towards an understanding of ecocriticism as a method that, much like a weed, refuses to stay in its allocated space, that disrupts and intrudes, crossing the boundary separating the distinctive domains of action in art, politics, and ecology. Like a weed, ecocritical methods exceed the limits of allocated space within green studies, nature writing, or the wider field of environmental studies. In the example of La Vigie, an ecocritical analysis strays into the domains of geopolitics and national security, social tensions, and policing. In this manner, ecocriticism can help move the debate beyond the focus on the obvious thematics of destroyed habitats and environmental art. If all art is capable of creating the conditions of emancipation, according to Jacques Rancière, then all art can be material of an ecocritical analysis, no matter what subject, theme, or medium it engages. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Great, so we'll just invite our speakers up into the front. We'll just grab some microphones. Well, thank you so much for coming here. Yes. What a fantastic introduction to the book, and really amazing argument for polyvocality. 23 contributors is quite something to have managed. Just to kick us off, I'm going to invite Charlotte to offer some thoughts and reflections, if that's okay.
Yes, happily. I had the privilege to get a sneak preview of the book. So I've actually lived through it, read my way through it, and it's just been a very, very exhilarating journey, despite a very gloomy background topic, because the inventiveness of all your contributors, you've just had one example, the inventiveness of thinking through, art history's themes with a slightly moved perspective, which tries not to center the artwork or the interpreter, but to connect, to move between, to move around, and that's just has been a very exhilarating read over the past few days. And what struck me in particular is that I think it is a book which really shows you the state of the art of this discipline, art history, and what it can do at this moment in time. And it is very different from when I was thinking about methods of art history with my co-author Michael Had, just after at the end of the 20th century, turn of the early 21st century, we thought about it very, very differently. And this has really been going on in my mind over the past few days. What is different? What has changed? And I recognize I have changed too, because I'm where Olga and Andrew are, and it's very interesting to think where were we 20 years ago. And the main difference was that we, unbeknownst to us, it was the end, I think, of a period, but we were writing this book, and perhaps we could only write it at that time, at an end of a period of intense theory discussions and people, demarcating different theoretical terrains. And we tried to map it. We tried to ask ourselves, why is theory important? Is it just a fashionable tool to, sort of fashionable thing to be throwing around? Or why is it important in art history? And we mapped it, from the birth, so to speak, of art history in the 19th century, what theories do. And theories we found, or we describe it in such a way, do something particular in art history. They provide us with a way of bridging a gap of one. So in the 19th century, it's basically the gap, we call it the hermeneutic gap, between the present state of interpretation and something in the past. So how do we bridge to the past? And then I think in the 70s it moved, you called it horizontally, it sort of moved into questions of social concern one way or another, and there were questions of how to bridge, and theory had to do with Marxism, so for example, for class issues or, capital accumulation, or in the then emerging post-colonial discussions, it was geographically, who can speak about what culture and what objects, and how do we negotiate? And you needed some kind of theory for that. And this is so interesting because it's since then, my students don't care about it. I really, perhaps I do still care about it. I mean, you could still ask this, in ecocritical art history has a hermeneutical gap to bridge, But this is not, this is not highlighted, and this offers Andrew and Olga an extremely generous space where, various different views can come together, and they don't need to be homogenized along a theoretical axis. So you have Olga's contribution, which emphasizes dissonance, unruliness, and you have others where you think, is this not some kind of new romantic version of ecocritical? And they all sit next to each other. And I think this is what is the most stimulating to students, actually.
It's really fascinating to think about what the difference is between offering something that is kind of theories of ecocriticism and your presentation of this as methods, and that does feel like a real shift from that earlier moment. Also, when I was a student some decades ago, I wonder if you could talk a little bit, Olga, Andrew, about what you mean by methods, or what is the kind of imperative behind presenting methods rather than a kind of critical, theoretical handbook, as it were.
I mean, shall I start with the simple version, and Olga can give it the subtle nuance take? But I would say that when we started on this project, I thought we might do a book that would have diagrams, almost like recipes, in it for orientation. And I was thinking of things like the SAGE. In social sciences, SAGE have that territory of diagrams, headings, tables that would allow you to orientate yourself in a certain area. And I think my initial and I think naive thought was that would be useful for students. I now know that SAGE have disappeared, have backed away from that recipe book approach, I think. And also art history has never done it very well. I mean, I'm thinking of Marcia Poynton's Wheel of Art History, or, which is very, very simple, and it was very useful in its day, but it looks so simple. And an eco-critical diagram would be more like a spider's web. Romy, we were talking about webs earlier, but I mean, the metaphor of the web would be more appropriate. But then I think when we started to speak about it more, maybe Olga, you want to come in now, I think we moved beyond the notion of a methodological recipe book, and more like an embodied experiential approach to whatever material one is looking at.
I think I made a face when you said that we should have a wheel in the book. Yeah. But actually, joking apart, I think what happened actually through these conversations that Andrew and I had, what I think again to really distill to this to something that I hope is very much also in our introduction, is that we did think about, is this going to be a book about, is it going to be a theory book, is it like eco-theory book, and then I think we landed on the idea of methods, and the distinction we made, I think it's the same distinction as you and Michael had made in this book, is that theory describes a hypothetical world in which we might want to live if we were to live in a world like that, and methods is something that gets us there. And so methods for us. And also coming back to what we said previously about the sense of emergency and the climate emergency and the students kind of coming to us and saying, what are we supposed to do now? We wanted to do something that would be on the side of action. So rather than describing a hypothetical reality, acting with tools, as I said, the first line of introduction is acting with the tools that we have. And that became an imperative. So on the side of doing things. For that discipline, essentially. So that's a distinction that I think we're making between theory and methods.
And you talk also about, and I think you mentioned in your introduction, Olga, that distinction between place and planet as requiring quite different commitments, not just in terms of the scale of commitment, but in terms of kind of what art history is trying to do rather than what it's kind of trying to describe, perhaps. So, and this is maybe a question for all of you, but how how does an eco-critical method or an eco-critical approach shift the commitments of the art historian? Or how does it change the project of art history from the project that kind of existed in some senses before this set of methods or before this moment of crisis?
Be interesting to hear your answer, because I kept thinking about that, because in many ways they're actually exemplary art history sort of give two crafts in that book. They do, you ask them probably to concentrate on a work of art or state that as a starting point. That is typical for art history. There's very close visual analysis. There's very, very subtle social contextualization. There's attentiveness to materiality. All this is what is, I think what really, really is at the core of art history and actually marks us out from other disciplines, is what we can actually bring to other disciplines. And this is very, very clear and strong in this book. So in a way, it does what I think broader art history these days does. Is that unfair?
No, it's completely fair. And in fact, actually, I'm going to cite you, Charlotte, and I'm going to cite Andrew on this, because I think it's really important to highlight this. When I had the privilege of working with Charlotte in Berlin at the Humboldt, and one of the projects that you're working on was the images of terror, and the idea of image manipulation, image operations. Incidentally, also the title of the book, incidentally also published by Manchester University Press, so this is plugging now, I'll publish that in a way. But the idea behind the image operations is that the images don't just illustrate the ideas, they produce real actions in the world, to put it very, very simply. And I thought it was incredibly powerful as an idea. It comes from, I think, the German idea of Bildwissenschaft, to taking images really seriously, which is something that's I felt in British academia is still not taken as seriously as it is there. But so absolutely that. So the idea that images matter because they produce events. They're not illustrations. So what happens in the media is that media has effect on people, and there's a real effect with real people, with real situations. And with Andrew is the warning that he gives to art historians in the ecological eye. Sorry, getting late now. That we must not let go, we must not surrender the visual. You will correct me. But the point is that art historians have those tools, and we must not give them away easily. Tempting as it might be to just do social analysis or just do activism or blow up the oil pipes, which is all very important as well, but not giving up the tools of visual analysis, I think, is something that I think is driving this project.
One of the words that we've also sort of come to view as very important, I think, in capturing this turn, or this I think behind your question, Charlotte, I got the sense of art history already kind of does this. It already is some of its modes.
In the core of how it does that. But of course, when it's under the lens of eco-criticism, something else. So you can shift that core to the decolonial question. You can shift it to what my students are interested in, but you can also shift it to eco-critical art history. So that stays the same. It's shifted, and then something else happens if the decentering of the anthropocentric viewpoint is, of course, something very specific of the writing here. So that's a difference.
Yeah. So no, that's useful. I mean, the word that I always focus on is care. So I think I see a lot of art historians who care about their subject, but I see differences in how they express care. So what I would say is some of those ways I find, as I was hinting at earlier, dysfunctional or problematic or troublesome to me as an expression of the discipline, and others I find deeply engaged and in a way activist. And feeling the pressures of the other than discipline, the extra disciplinary world that we also live in. And I think the authors that we've got who tuned in to some of the things that we were thinking of, and also we tuned into what they were doing, express how they care about their discipline and the planet in a way that feels coherent to me and feels exciting. And we did have some conversations, which I certainly won't go into, but we did have conversations where there was a little bit of a misunderstanding about how one would care within art history. And that meant that some conversations fell away. And I think that's obvious in any edited book, that happens. But with 23 authors, which, as you say, Lucy, rightly, it's enormous. And that's a lot, more than most. Well, normally you'd expect maybe 8 or 10. So the generosity was there, but I would say care, to me, keeps coming back as how one expresses care within the discipline is a crucial marker of whether this feels productive. Because also people care in other forms of art historical expression, which I feel very aligned to, that are not eco-critical in any obvious way. And that also, I would say, just to finish, that points towards future developments of this book, I would say. One can find different ways of contributing to what we're calling eco-critical art history that would express that care differently, more expansively, more radically.
So in some senses, rather than have a kind of book of 23 authors who were all absolutely kind of aligned and do the same thing, actually what you have is a kind of a collective understanding of the stakes of this project.
Yeah.
Political, ethical, as well as intellectual, that maybe marks that out from a kind of artistic project that might see representation as something perhaps more abstract and less politically grounded in the present moment. Maybe this is a moment to open up to...
Just to quickly, this is just something that I've been thinking about since Charlotte mentioned about the kind of the historical patterns in which revisions of art history have occurred. And so I guess, again, another kind of very quick and simple thing to say about that before we open it to questions is that the way that we have seen this project is indeed not to come up with a series of tools. This is how you do eco-art history. But very much to say that just like decolonization of the curriculum, just like feminist rereadings of the canon, this is a new way of working with art history. So this is a way of, if you like, ecologizing the curriculum. So that in the contemporary art course, ecology doesn't arrive at week 11 at the end when we're all done with doing the actual art history, but so that we rethink the curriculum without abandoning commitments to the colonial project, to the feminist project, but we rethink the curriculum with ecology in mind. So ecologizing the curriculum, quite simply.
Can I just, Andrew will kill me because he doesn't want the gloomy tones, but I just want, and he's quite right, we have enough of that, and you know, you do so well, but just to throw it into the discussion now, and I've said it to Andrew and Olga before, what will come after this? And I can think so many avenues, and my own research is, you know, currently engaged trying to figure, you know, in the theory of democracy, images don't figure at all. And so my project is to rethink images and their role in democracies, and that's clearly driven by contemporary concern. But I have recently, because I'm now back in Germany, and Germany has a particular history, and we are having several state elections, and it's very clear that there is, you would have never thought that it would have been possible in Germany, the far right is, is clearly winning some states. So, and we've seen some leaked election programs already, and it's very clear that their onslaught on academic activities that have something like eco-criticism or gender will be massive. So, in fact, you know, I said this to you, is your book arriving at a point almost like Michael's and mine 20 years ago, which is an endpoint. And then something else starts, and it was a lucky one. It was a very inclusive one, which started after the book that Michael and I wrote. And I wonder what will come now. And I wonder, and this is the discussion we're currently having, while you promote the activist aspect of it, I wonder if that is actually a clever route to take for us in the future. If you should do what we do, but not highlight as activists, because that actually makes it vulnerable to be submerged, to be attacked, to be eradicated.
Yeah.
I'll just leave it there. I think that is a new challenge for art history, and which we have to rethink what that means for methods.
I mean, I value that, but rather than us reply, maybe we should give people a chance to. We might come back to this.
Do it. So Romy has a roaming mic, and we'll just
Hello, thank you very much. This is for kind of good. And thank you very much for stimulating discussion. Actually, I have a question for Olga Smith, if I may, but it's linked to the final point which you just made, because when you have Vigie in France, what immediately came to mind for me was actually a kind of a religious Christian dimension. So the Vigie that came to my mind, I was thinking about Paris, was when Notre Dame burnt down. A lot of people then came and sat around and held a Vigie to the cathedral. And so I just wonder if you had that in mind, and is because then, and even actually your cover, what to my mind, what came was a candle, in which you associate with the Vigie, and also there's an element of bearing witness when you're doing that. So there's either a bearing witness. The different phrases that came to mind was bearing witness, which is maybe an answer to your question. Are we bearing witness to the end of a certain world that we knew? Or there's also holding a candle to, which has this critical kind of essential element, conflictual element that you had. So that's just what came to mind. I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on that.
I mean, I don't know what to add to this. This is lovely. Thank you. And I do think it's like you're right. It does speak to Charlotte's point, and so it is a lovely analogy. But yeah, also. But I think also maybe I'll just pick up again on this idea of holding a vigil and being gathered together, united. It really is. I said this before, but I'll just emphasize this again. Really driving this book was the sense that we have students who are anxious and who experience anxiety and ecological grief, and so it really does just feel like standing up and having a vigil and doing something about this. This is again our way of doing something with methods that we have at our disposal. So I'll just reiterate that.
Thank you very much. A fantastic presentation, very thought-provoking. I have two related questions. Maybe they are related. One is, what about pre-modern period? How do we show that care and eco-critical methods to come forward in ways that would make sense for all practices of art history through time and space? And the second one is, how do you think these new methods and care and commitment would infiltrate the museum? And how does the museum actually begin to reflect on the responsibility that our students are expressing, and everyone else should, and the world should? And the museum is where so much is taught about these visual worlds, cultural worlds, material worlds. How would you think this can infiltrate the museum?
I can speak to the museum part.
Renaissance?
Yeah, I mean, the first one, Suzanne, to say is that there are some examples of pre-modern work chapters in the book, which is super important because of that claim we make that the geographies and the temporal breadth is important, but it's not complete, and it could go much, much further. And you know very well that the kind of thinking with nature in, say, architecture in different parts of the world, for example, I was mindful of your work actually when we were putting this together, is that notion of much more expanded ways to think of the pre-modern, and deep time, of course. I mean, the expansion of the range of what it's possible to call art history is something that is raised implicitly in the book. So there's nothing in the book that doesn't, I think, allow for that kind of expansion. I would say I would put that invitation out to others to take some of those thoughts and build them in different parts of our discipline. Yeah, Olga, maybe you want to speak about the museum.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, but just to quickly mention is that it seems to have been, so we were very careful to think widely in terms of the, especially since both Andrew and I work on contemporary period, we're very aware of the limits of our own knowledge, and so we said we absolutely must have as wide a chronological range as possible. And it seems to be, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to be that what is especially interesting for the pre-modernist is the use of methods within material ecologies. So anything that relates to, we had Catherine Karkov at one of our presentations talking about a casket made out of whale bone. What happens to the whales? So interest in materials and in the ecological perspective seems to be an incredibly rich vein for medievalists to think through. So this is just one example. On the subject of the museum, this is again so topical and so interesting. So I have started teaching with the book, in fact, and so one of the first things that I'm doing is I'm taking my students to the museum, and we're working with the Land Gallery in Newcastle, where I'm based. And the idea is that the students and I are going to design an eco trail of the collection. So the students are going to take an artwork on the collection, in the display in the collection, and we're going to come up with something like a pedagogical tool that will be available for general audiences. Really interested in kind of expanding that and thinking beyond this particular example. So please get in touch with me if you're interested also in doing something with museums. But you're absolutely right. In our work as art historians, we always go to the museums. So what do we do with these tools of ecological attention? And so this is very much live, and I would very much like to continue with this in relation to pedagogical practices, but also in our work as curators as well. So thank you for this question.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for the presentation, and it's fantastic to know that this book is out there, because I'm also teaching art history and in search of such methods. I'm very interested in how you address art through the decolonial lens in the context of ecocriticism. There's so many resources to think about the ways in which, what we call art today, what became art across modernity and across the history of capitalism, that kind of came to define something like a global contemporary, was also participant in the destruction of other cultural worlds. So that, in a sense, and this is not to accuse artists of, in some direct sense, complicity with colonialism necessarily, but the modern or early modern history of art often can be understood as traveling along the same tracks as the colonial destruction of other cultural worlds, which were then disparaged as lost in time, primitive, and so on and so on. And that sort of depredation of other cultural worlds was a necessary prerequisite for often ecological forms of destruction and violence. So I'm just really curious to know how art itself kind of fares within, under the hands of eco-criticism, if you see what I mean, art as we mean it more latterly.
Yeah, thank you. Can I just quickly say that one of the areas that I'm aware of that does feature in the book, I would say, with Hawaiian performance artists who are indigenous to Hawaii. That's one example in the book. But much more widely than that, I've got colleagues in Edinburgh who are working on Central and South America. And one of the most productive areas is to give attention to indigenous artists themselves and how they are working. Now, most of the literature around that is around the ethics of circulating those works within, other forms of museum and display culture, exhibition culture, which includes Western forms. But I think this is where the case study becomes quite important. I think if you give proper attention to the work that artists are doing, now that captures contemporary artists who are working with their own indigenous systems and relationships with their materials, their ideas. It does raise another question, which is how we capture work that is now not archived, not of this period. And I think there are challenges there in terms of how an art historian can find the practices that obviously went on in different parts of the world. But I noticed that, I say, particularly my colleagues in Central South America are finding amazing projects that kind of bypass or reject the logics of museum and gallery worlds that we're kind of more used to in Europe and the States, I would say.
But isn't there, I mean, in contemporary art also the aspect, the other side of the coin? I mean, you have Peter Schneemann talking about Doug Aitken, a huge part of contemporary world is still, shipping works around the world for huge expenses. It's a vastly environmentally actually disastrous enterprise. Artists being shipped to different worlds to respond to something. I think from a proper eco-critical perspective, then that needs to be tackled, actually.
And I think museums are now becoming more nervous about their footprint, but not enough, clearly. And I completely agree with you, Charlotte. There's no disagreement with you at all.
But just to quickly say that we end with section 6, which is decolonial and indigenous perspectives, because, like, in some ways, I mean, I'll just quickly say the word intersectionality. And so this was kind of our thinking that we close the book with these kind of discourses, because they're really important. That's it. I'm not going to take any more time on this, but our closing on this chapter meant that in some ways that what is to come is probably going to come out of this particular bridging of the decolonial and eco perspective.
Of course, I'm longing to read your book. It was extremely interesting. I wanted to add a little bit of something a little bit more dramatic, because weeds grow quite slowly. We are thinking about war at the moment, and I was very interested in the way you mentioned Rancière, but I wondered to what extent you would, any of your world, which isn't quite my world, had taken on board Virilio and his idea not only of accident, but the exhibition he did in 2002, which was called Ce qui arrive, which is about accidents or catastrophes, and in English is called Unknown Quantity. But what it was about was the relationship between political catastrophe and ecological disaster. And there were many, many juxtapositions of images, like, bombings and oil fields and then oil spills. But there was this, his thesis is not only that we are in between accidents/catastrophes, which obviously we are constantly, but that every accident/catastrophe involves its ecological impact. So, I mean, you've been talking very interestingly about a kind of longue durée, which avoids the day-to-day of politics, but there are these wider impacts where big catastrophes, man-made, blend into ecological disaster. And I just wondered if he was a reference for you in the world of eco-art history.
Virilio, not per se. I don't recall him coming up. Oh, Virilio, I don't think he has.
But your point, your wider point, I think, is really important here. And that, obviously, it's been in my mind too, not just recently, as in very recent events. But adjacent to that, there's a term I've been again sort of thinking about that comes from political science and international relations, which is weaponized interdependence, right? Weaponized interdependence. So, because You can have that. It's not mine. But the reality of that points to all kinds of conflicts there have been, where the eco-cliches we're all interdependent, and interdependencies are very important. And they're crucial to how we structured the book. But when those become weaponized, and when those become in conflict around the world, the level of complexity and the level of damage and violence is extraordinarily complicated, which is one you can read even this week's events from an eco-critical perspective, which is not to ignore or sideline in any way the human, but it's to include the human alongside other reference. So that weaponized interdependence, I think, is a terrifying term, really. But I don't think it does speak to some of our conditions, and also speaks to your observation, Charles, which I completely agree with, which is the political changes that are happening pose dangers for any discipline, whether that's art practice, whether it's museum world, or whether it's a relatively small discipline, which I could speak a lot about, is how small art history is in this field. Let's not forget the fact that we are tiny. But I think there can be strength in that radical cell structure, in a way. Thanks for that.
All the way at the back.
Thank you all so much for listening to Mark for producing the book and for this great event. I suppose following on from like the last thought about what comes after, and also then linking to like weaponizing, I guess, the idea of interconnectedness as well. I was wondering about, as it feels like you've been there through since eco-criticism was becoming a term for art history through to now, which feels like, we were saying this is a very full event and it's really growing, and I'm doing my PhD and I'm in my third year in eco-criticism and Italian Renaissance art, and even in that time I've noticed, and that's 3 years in. So I'm wondering what your hopes are, or maybe what your predictions are for what happens after, in terms of what you would like to happen within the academy. And also, I suppose I feel that there's something lost as it becomes subsumed into the kind of general syllabus, like it could potentially lose its edge. How do you keep that? How do you keep the activist side of it? I suppose, like all of these kind of revisionist frameworks that happen, it's on the one hand great that they're more widely used, on the other you slightly lose something, in my opinion. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know. So I think it would be great one day if we did not, if we just stopped even like using the word eco-critical, if we just did art history with ecology within it. It's a bit like, some of my artist friends who work with photography complain that they're still like in the fairs that are dedicated to photography. They say, we just want to be artists. And so I guess maybe it's a little bit like this as well. I think maybe it would actually be great if it's just subsumed into the curriculum, and we just have art history with ecology and understand art history as incorporating that term. So it's a very simple thing to say, and it is 7:05. But
the night's young.
yeah. So, but I would say that will be the aim for me. So I'm not like a special art historian, but I'm a regular art historian who teaches with critical art methods. I don't know.
But I think the other forward-pointing aspect of this book and people working in that field is, I think, none of us can look into the future, but I think the signs are clear enough in the Western world. At least we are in a period of degrowth of museums. They're expanding elsewhere. They're expanding at an accelerating speed on the Arabian Peninsula, in Asian countries. Museums in the Western world, they're there's degrowth, there's defunding across, and the same is true for universities. So the really, really forward-pointing aspect shown here is that art history, art history, like so many other humanities subjects, will come under pressure. Art history shows here its usefulness, how it can actually talk to other subjects, how it can integrate itself with other disciplines without losing its identity. And I think this is the really, really forward-pointing bit that the book actually signals, how we can do that.
Also, let me say, when you finish your Renaissance eco-critical PhD, you'll have a lot of agency in how that does develop. I mean, this will happen in a way that it's too broad to be monitored and directed. It will happen. The other thing I would say as well is that going back to exhibitions, is that there was a period in the 80s where there were very, very few environmentally aware exhibitions in the 80s. There was a number in the 60s and 70s. And then it was really suppressed, again, through kind of neoliberal pressure against them. They just didn't happen. And now, of course, we've seen in the last maybe 10 years a phenomenal amount. And there is a possible danger, and again, I take Charlotte's warning here, there's a possible danger that the funding will dry up for those kinds of experiments. And I don't mean just contemporary art, I mean any kind of environmentally aware exhibition. So, there are battles to be had here, I think, and I think not shying away from that. But I think positive work, this is where the positive comes in, positive work is what will attract funders, audiences, support, engagement. And that's where we can maybe lose the eco-critical word, when just good work is done, careful work is done.
I suppose the hope, as is also the hope for feminist art histories and decolonial art histories, is that the discipline itself and the practice of the discipline retains a sense of the state, that it doesn't have to be about the term, but the discipline can't retrench with that kind of degrowth that you have identified.
But I think the one thing that we also, say quite clearly in our introduction, that we say that it is vital to art history to adopt eco-critical perspective, so it is not left behind. It is also really, really important at this point to make a stake in that terrain, because that is one of the most important things happening right now.
I think we might have time for one final question, maybe.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm a practitioner, not a historian. And as a practitioner, you periodically come upon periods where you make choices. You don't know what the future is going to be for obvious reasons, but you do make choices. And I'm at one of those choices. Having just had an exhibition which was successful, 3 options came to me out of that. One was the art market with a quite prestigious gallery. And I just thought, why should I do this? My age especially. And then I've worked with Indigenous people. And one of the problems of working as a Western artist with Indigenous people is the word appropriation. You must be really careful. You don't appropriate their wonderful ways of working. The third one, and this is for Olga, was out of the blue. I got invited to join a small group of musicians, poets, and artists, just 4 of us actually, on dissonance. And that was the one I chose. And it's all in your word, art critical. I think we're at such a point in the world, we make choices, in honesty, hopefully, which do allow us to be critical without being disrespectful or just stupid. So thank you for the dissonances, and I'd like to talk to you. I've taken the book down. I shall certainly go and have a read of that. So I don't know if that's a question, really. Thank you very much.
It seems like a beautiful note to end on. Actually, a wonderful kind of summary, but also somehow a call to action. So thank you.
Yeah, it is a call to action.
And please join me, everyone, in thanking Olga and Charlotte.